At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on a quiet field in Pennsylvania, 10,000 men and women in steel and iron armor were fighting a war that was not real. Then, without warning, the sky tore open, and a war that was very real landed right in the middle of them. Before you find out exactly what happened next, hit that like button, subscribe if you are new here, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Now, let's step onto that field. Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, does not look like a place that would end an alien invasion. It is a small town surrounded by rolling green hills, quiet farms, and a two-lane highway that most people drive past without a second thought. But for 17 days every summer, something strange happens just outside of town, at a place called Cooper's Lake Campground. 10,000 people arrive from every corner of the world, and for 2.5 weeks, they build a kingdom out of canvas and wood. This was the Pennsic War. It was not a real war, not in the way most people understood that word. It was the largest gathering of the Society for Creative Anachronism on the planet, an event where two enormous groups, the Kingdom of the East and the Middle Kingdom, came together to relive the Middle Ages. They dressed in wool and linen. They built pavilions with wooden frames and canvas roofs. They cooked over open fires using recipes older than the United States itself. And every single day in the open fields near the lake, thousands of them put on real armor, picked up real weapons, and fought. Not with steel edges, not for blood, but with everything else that made medieval combat real. The armor was authentic, heavy steel plate, chainmail, leather, and padded gambesons underneath. The swords and maces were rattan, a tough, flexible wood that could take a full swing without killing a man, but it still hurt enough that nobody wanted to get hit twice. Shields locked together in walls the same way they had 1,000 years ago. Longbowmen and crossbowmen lined up behind the front ranks, just like they had at Agincourt, just like they had at Cressy, and when the horn sounded, they let arrows fly by the hundreds. At the center of the Middle Kingdom's forces stood a man named Duke Thomas Bishop, though almost everyone on the field just called him Duke Tom. He was 58 years old, built like a retired linebacker, and he had spent 30 years fighting in this event, first as a young knight with more energy than sense, and now as a commander who other fighters actually listened to. Duke Tom had served 2 tours overseas before he ever picked up a rattan sword, and he brought that same discipline to the battlefield here. He ran his unit like a real formation, shield wall tight, spears bristling out from behind it, archers rotating in and out to keep a steady rain of arrows falling on the enemy line. That Friday, the 17-day war had just begun. The gates had opened, wagons full of gear rolled down dirt roads, and by early afternoon, the Warpoint's battles were already underway on the open field east of camp. It was exactly 1 o'clock when the first battle of the war kicked off, banners raised, horns blown, 2 armies of a few thousand each marching toward one another across the grass. Nobody on that field knew that somewhere far above the atmosphere, a scout vessel belonging to something called the HFY Expansion had been quietly mapping Earth for 6 days. Their analysts had studied American aircraft carriers. They had studied missile silos in North Dakota, submarine bases in Virginia, and satellite networks stretching across the globe. They had flagged every major military installation on 6 continents as a potential threat. What their sensors picked up near a small Pennsylvania town confused them. Thousands of humans, gathered in one place, wearing metal armor, carrying edged weapons, organized into disciplined ranks and formations. No modern vehicles in the fighting area. No firearms detected anywhere on the field. To the HFY analysts, this looked like the single softest military target on the entire planet. A primitive ceremonial gathering, unarmed by any real standard, completely unprotected. Their commander, a HFY officer named Vorontel, made the call personally. If Earth's real armies were too dangerous to approach directly, then this gathering, whatever it was, would be the perfect place to establish a foothold. Land quietly, demonstrate strength. Force a surrender that could be broadcast back to every other human government on the planet as proof of HFY dominance. It was, by every measure the HFY Expansion had ever used before, a reasonable plan. At 1:14 in the afternoon, while Duke Tom's shield wall was locking together for the first push of the day, the clouds above Cooper's Lake Campground began to ripple in a way that clouds are not supposed to ripple. A low hum rolled across the field, quiet at first, then louder, until it was under everyone's boots as much as in their ears. Fighters on both sides slowed their advance. Someone near the back ranks pointed up and shouted a single word that would echo across the entire encampment within minutes. Look, the first thing most people assumed was that it was some kind of demonstration. Pennsic had seen strange things before. Elaborate court entrances, dramatic royal processions, even a fireworks show one year that nearly got the whole event shut down by the local fire marshal. So when a shape the size of a school bus dropped out of the clouds, glowing faintly along its edges, more than a few fighters actually laughed and pointed cameras that were not cameras. But their own eyes, wide with disbelief. The craft came down hard in the open field between the two armies, crushing a section of split-rail fencing and flattening a merchant's empty supply cart that had been left there overnight. It hissed as it settled, venting some kind of pale vapor from vents along its underside. For 3 full seconds, 10,000 people simply stood and stared. Duke Tom did not stare. 30 years of combat instinct, both real and recreated, told him this was not a prop. Props did not crush split-rail fencing made of solid oak. He raised a gloved fist, the signal for his unit to hold position, and kept his eyes locked on the ship. A ramp lowered from the craft's side with a low mechanical groan. What stepped out was not human, not close to it. They stood over 7 feet tall, wrapped in dark plated armor that shimmered faintly with an energy field, and carried weapons that looked nothing like anything on that field, sleek. Glowing barrels instead of blades. 12 of them formed a loose line facing the crowd, and the one at the front raised a small device to what might have been its mouth. Primitive inhabitants of this territory, the device said, translating the alien's words into flat mechanical English that carried across the suddenly silent field. You are unarmed and undefended. Surrender this location and no harm will come to you. For a moment, nobody moved. Then from somewhere in the East Kingdom ranks, a young fighter named Ryan Walsh, 24 years old, still holding his rattan longsword, called out the question that was apparently on everyone's mind. Are you guys with the Merchants Guild? Because that entrance was a little much. The alien commander, Vorontel, paused. His translator had not been built to process sarcasm, and for a brief, confused moment, he mistook the crowd's stillness for fear, rather than the simple fact that 10,000 people were trying to figure out if this was a very expensive prank. They do not resist, Voron said to his second-in-command, satisfaction clear in his tone even through the translator. Proceed with the demonstration. That word, demonstration, turned out to be the worst possible choice Vorontel could have made. Because at Pennsic, a demonstration meant exactly one thing to nearly everyone standing on that field: siege engines. Just past the tree line, less than 200 yards from where the alien craft had landed, sat 3 full-sized siege weapons that had been set up that morning for an afternoon demonstration to the public: a trebuchet, a Roman-style ballista, and a torsion-powered catapult. Each built by hand over the winter by a group of engineers who took historical accuracy extremely seriously. A blacksmith named Dave Thompson had spent the last hour loading the ballista with a heavy wooden bolt, tipped in this case with an actual forged steel point. For the demonstration shot, he had planned to fire into an empty field. When the alien ship crashed down and startled every horse and every human within earshot, Dave's ballista, sitting on wooden wheels that were never meant to be jostled by a full-grown man stumbling backward in surprise, tipped sideways. The safety catch, never designed for this kind of impact, slipped, the torsion arm released. The steel-tipped bolt shot across the field in a flat, brutal line and buried itself directly into the side of the alien landing craft, with a sound like a church bell being struck by a freight train. Sparks erupted from the hull. An alarm inside the craft began to wail. And Vorontel, mid-sentence about the terms of surrender, turned just in time to watch smoke pour from a hole that should not have existed in armor his engineers had assured him was impenetrable to primitive weaponry. Dave Thompson, still holding the rope that had somehow not fired the shot on purpose, looked at the smoking ship, looked at his ballista, and said the only thing that made sense. Well, that wasn't supposed to happen yet. For exactly 2 seconds, silence held the field. Then Vorontel's second-in-command, a hulking Kesevar soldier standing near the ramp, raised his weapon and fired a warning shot into the dirt, close enough to Ryan Walsh's boots that the young fighter jumped backward into 3 of his own shield mates. That was the moment the entire tone of the day changed. Duke Tom's voice cut across the field, the same voice he had used to command real soldiers decades earlier. Shields up. Archers knock. It should not have worked that fast. In any normal army, an order like that takes drills, takes years of practice under real pressure. But these were not normal people playing dress-up. Many of them had trained for this exact motion for a decade or more, not against real threats, but against blunt weapons swung by people who genuinely wanted to knock them down. Muscle memory did not know the difference between a rattan sword and a plasma rifle. It only knew the command. Shields locked together with a sound like thunder rolling sideways across the grass. Behind that wall, longbowmen and crossbowmen who had spent the morning warming up for a mock battle raised their weapons instead toward 12 very real, very confused alien soldiers. Loose, the volley that followed looked almost exactly like the old paintings of Agincourt, hundreds of arrows rising together in a dark arc before falling as one. Most bounced harmlessly off the Kesevar energy shields, sparking uselessly in the afternoon sun, but not all of them. A dozen crossbow bolts, tipped in solid forged steel rather than the blunted points normally used on the field, found gaps where shield generators had already been weakened by Dave's earlier. Unintentional shot. 2 Kesevar soldiers dropped where they stood. Vorontel stared at the falling arrows with something that, on a human face, would have been called disbelief. His threat assessment had told him these creatures were unarmed. His sensors had detected no firearms, no explosives, nothing that matched any known weapon's signature. What his sensors had failed to account for was that not every dangerous weapon in the galaxy needs a battery. Fall back to formation, Voron ordered, his voice tighter now. Deploy secondary shielding. His soldiers regrouped near the smoking ship, energy shields flickering back to full strength, weapons raised toward the shield wall. What they did not account for was the sheer number of people now converging on that single field. Word had spread through camp faster than any modern alert system could have managed. Fighters from every corner of Cooper's Lake campground, armored and unarmored, some still pulling on chainmail as they ran, began pouring toward the battlefield from every direction. Among them was a woman named Sarah Coleman, a crossbow marshal who had spent the last 4 years teaching new fighters how to safely load and fire arbalists, the heavy, steel-bowed crossbows capable of punching through armor that lighter bows could never dent. She arrived at the front line with 6 of her students, all of them cranking their weapons taut as they ran. "Target the joints," she shouted to anyone within earshot, pointing toward the places where the alien armor visibly flexed at the shoulders and knees. "Just like we drill on the Pell. Hit where it bends." It was, in its own strange way, exactly the kind of tactical thinking that had won real battles centuries earlier. Full-plate armor was nearly unstoppable head-on, but every suit of armor, human or otherwise, needed places to bend, and every place that bent was a place that could be struck. Vorontel watched 2 more of his soldiers stumble as heavy steel bolts found exactly those gaps, and for the first time since his scout craft had entered Earth's atmosphere. A new thought entered his mind, one his intelligence officers had never prepared him for. This planet's celebration was better armed than its armies. He keyed his communicator, voice sharp with the first real edge of concern. "This is Vorontel. Send the second craft. We require reinforcement." Somewhere above the clouds, a second shape began its descent. The second Kesevar craft came down faster than the first, less graceful, clearly responding to an urgent call rather than a planned landing. It touched down nearly 400 yards from the original site, in an open meadow that, unfortunately for its pilot, sat directly between the trebuchet crew and their intended target range. A man named Mike Sullivan, one of the trebuchet engineers, had spent the winter building his machine to hurl a 200-pound sack of sand, nearly 300 yards for the afternoon demonstration. He had never, in any planning meeting, discussed hurling that same sack at an alien spacecraft. But when the ship dropped into his firing lane less than a minute before his scheduled shot, and his crew looked at him with the same wide-eyed expression he was almost certainly wearing himself, Mike made a decision that would be talked about at Pennsic for years to come. "Pull the pin," he said. The trebuchet's arm swung with a groan of straining timber, launching its 200-pound payload in a long, heavy arc across the field. It struck the second craft's forward section with a deep, bone-rattling thud that staggered the ship sideways on its landing struts. It did not destroy the vessel, but it did something almost as valuable. It knocked out whatever passed for its primary sensor array, leaving the newly landed Kesevar reinforcements effectively blind to anything more than 100 yards out. Duke Tom saw the opening the moment it happened. Years of real combat experience did not simply vanish because the weapons on this field were made of wood and steel instead of steel and gunpowder. He turned to the fighters gathering behind him, easily 300 strong now and growing by the minute, and gave the order that would define the rest of that afternoon. Split into 3 lines. First line holds the shield wall. Second line, archers and crossbows, keep them pinned. Third line circles wide and hits their flank before they can reset. It was, almost word for word, the same tactic English longbowmen had used against heavily armored French knights centuries earlier, forcing an enemy that relied on frontal strength into a position where mobility mattered more than raw power. Vorontel's forces, trained for conventional warfare against modern weapons, had no answer for an enemy that fought like it had studied the exact history the Kesevar expansion had never bothered to research. From the flank, a squad led by Sheriff Carl Anderson, the real modern-day sheriff of Butler County, who had been called to the scene the moment emergency dispatch started receiving frantic reports, arrived with several deputies and a small contingent of state police. They carried firearms, and while those firearms proved just as ineffective against Kesevar shielding as anything else on the field, their arrival brought something more valuable than bullets: radios, coordination, and a direct line to the county's emergency management office, which had already alerted the Pennsylvania National Guard. "This is Sheriff Anderson," Carl said into his radio, watching in genuine disbelief as several thousand medieval reenactors coordinated a battlefield flanking maneuver against extraterrestrial soldiers less than a mile from the nearest gas station. "I need you to hear this clearly. I need air support, and I need it fast. And I need you to believe me when I tell you why." Vorontel, meanwhile, was rapidly losing the tactical picture. His forward line was pinned by relentless arrow and bolt fire. His second craft sensors were down. And now a mass of humans in heavy armor, moving with disciplined, practiced formation, was sweeping wide around his flank, exactly the way his own historical combat simulations had once trained him to counter. Except no one on his crew had ever expected human tactics from 600 years in the past to still work on a modern battlefield. "Status report," Voron demanded. "Sir," his second-in-command replied, voice tight with something that, translated, came out sounding remarkably close to disbelief. "Our shields are failing faster than projected. Their projectile weapons appear to be exploiting joint weaknesses with alarming consistency. And sir, they are flanking us using coordinated infantry tactics." Vorontel stared out across a field full of steel armor, wooden weapons, and disciplined ranks that had somehow turned his overwhelming technological advantage into a fair fight. A cold and entirely new kind of dread settled into him, the dread of a commander who was beginning to understand that his intelligence briefing had been catastrophically wrong. "Prepare full retreat contingency," he said quietly, "but hold the line until I give the order." He did not know yet just how quickly that order would come. The flanking maneuver hit exactly where Duke Tom had aimed it, the seam between the 2 Kesevar landing sites, where reinforcements from the second craft had not yet fully linked up with Vorontel's original squad. 300 armored fighters, moving in disciplined formation, closed that gap in under 2 minutes, cutting the Kesevar force into 2 isolated pockets that could no longer support one another. Ryan Walsh, still carrying nothing more than his rattan longsword, found himself face to face with a Kesevar soldier whose armor had already been cracked open at the shoulder by an earlier crossbow bolt. The alien raised its weapon, and Ryan, acting on nothing but instinct built from years of practice bouts, did something no Kesevar combat simulation had ever accounted for. He stepped inside the weapon's reach entirely, closing the distance so fast that the alien had no room left to aim, and drove the pommel of his sword directly into the cracked seam in the armor. The alien staggered, weapon clattering from its grip. Ryan pressed his sword flat against its exposed neck, the same disarming hold he had practiced 1,000 times against human opponents who were, at least, trying just as hard to hit him back. "Yield," Ryan said, breathing hard. "That's how this works. You yield, nobody else gets hurt." Through the failing translator on its wrist, the alien managed a single strangled word. "Yielding. Across the field, Sarah Coleman's crossbow line had methodically worked through the Kesevar front rank's shielding, one exposed joint at a time. Until nearly half of Vorontel's original squad had either surrendered or fallen back toward the smoking wreck of the first ship. Dave Thompson's ballista crew, having reloaded twice more since their accidental first shot, kept a steady, deliberate rhythm of steel-tipped bolts aimed directly at the ship's hull, widening the breach with each impact. Vorontel watched his forces crumble not from any single overwhelming blow, but from 1,000 small, coordinated ones, each individually survivable, together completely unstoppable. He understood, with the clear, cold logic his species valued above almost everything else, that continuing this engagement would not end in victory. It would end in the total loss of 2 landing craft and every soldier under his command. He keyed his communicator one final time. "This is Vorontel. All units cease engagement. We are requesting terms." The field went quiet by degrees, shield walls holding their line but no longer advancing, bows lowered but not yet set aside. Duke Tom walked forward alone, still in full armor, until he stood less than 20 feet from the Kesevar commander. "You wanted our surrender," Duke Tom said, his voice carrying easily across the stillness. "I think we can talk about terms instead." Vorontel studied the man in front of him. This human who had somehow organized 10,000 civilians into a fighting force capable of humbling technology that had subdued a dozen less prepared worlds before this one. "Your weapons," Voron said slowly, "registered as primitive on every scan we conducted." "They are primitive," Duke Tom said. "That's kind of the point. We practice with them, because our ancestors used them to survive worse things than bad weather and bandits. Turns out that history is still useful." From somewhere behind the shield wall, a distant, growing thrum of rotor blades echoed across the field. The unmistakable sound of Pennsylvania National Guard helicopters, finally closing in on the coordinates Sheriff Anderson had relayed nearly 20 minutes earlier. Vorontel looked up at the darkening sky, then back at the 10,000 people who had turned his invasion into a rout using weapons his own people had dismissed as historical curiosities, and made the only decision that still made tactical sense. "Full withdrawal," he said quietly into his communicator. "All units return to the craft. This location is not viable for further operations." The Kesevar expansion's 2 landing craft lifted off just under an hour after they had first touched down. One of them, trailing a thin stream of smoke from the whole Dave Thompson's ballista, had punched clean through its hull. As they climbed above the tree line, National Guard helicopters arrived to find not a battlefield full of casualties, but 10,000 exhausted. Adrenaline-soaked reenactors standing in loose formation, several dozen surrendered alien soldiers sitting under guard near the wreckage of a supply cart. And Duke Thomas Bishop, calmly giving orders to secure the area exactly the way he had once secured real objectives decades earlier. Sheriff Carl Anderson spent the better part of the next 6 hours trying to explain to increasingly senior officials, first county, then state, then eventually federal, exactly how a medieval reenactment event had repelled an extraterrestrial incursion using bows, crossbows, and a Roman ballista. Nobody believed him at first. Then they watched the footage that dozens of attendees had captured on their phones, and belief stopped being optional. Vorontel's official report, submitted to Kesevar High Command roughly 4 hours after departure, became something of a legend within his own chain of command, not for its success, but for its brutal honesty. It read, in part, that the targeted region contained an unregistered concentration of heavily trained, disciplined infantry equipped with projectile weapons capable of exploiting standard shield weaknesses, supported by siege-class artillery of surprising accuracy. His final recommendation was simple and absolute. This specific region of the planet was not to be approached again without a full military assessment. And under no circumstances should any future scouting mission underestimate a gathering simply because its weapons looked old. Kesevar High Command reviewed the engagement records twice, then quietly removed Earth from their list of viable expansion targets altogether, citing, in language that would have made Duke Tom laugh out loud if he had ever seen it, unacceptably high resistance from an unregistered civilian population. Back at Cooper's Lake Campground, life did something remarkable in the days that followed. It went back to normal, or at least as normal as 17 days of medieval camping in rural Pennsylvania could ever be. The Warpoint's battles resumed the very next morning, slightly better attended than usual, with a noticeably higher demand for crossbow lessons and ballista demonstrations. Dave Thompson became something of a local celebrity, his ballista roped off with a small hand-painted sign that simply read, "This weapon has seen combat." Ryan Walsh kept fighting on the field every single day for the rest of that war, though he later admitted that yielding an actual alien soldier had permanently changed the way he approached every practice bout that followed. Sarah Coleman's crossbow classes filled up faster than they ever had before, with a waiting list that stretched well into the following summer. And Duke Tom Bishop, when asked by a reporter weeks later how it felt to have organized the successful defense of Earth's first contact encounter, simply shrugged and said that leading people through chaos was leading people through chaos, whether the enemy carried a sword or something considerably stranger. The lesson in the end was not really about swords or crossbows or steel-tipped ballista bolts. It was about the simple, stubborn fact that history does not disappear just because the world moves forward. The skills, the discipline, and the hard-won knowledge that generations of humans had passed down through centuries of practice were still there, waiting quietly in a field in Pennsylvania, ready the moment they were needed again. Nobody had expected them to matter. That was exactly why they did. If this story kept you hooked all the way to the end, that's exactly the kind of feedback that helps this channel keep making more like it. Drop a comment below and let me know which moment hit hardest for you, whether it was Dave's accidental first shot, Ryan's disarm, or Duke Tom walking out to negotiate terms with an alien commander like it was just another Tuesday. Share this video with someone who needs to see history prove itself useful one more time, and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.